What makes UNC Charlotte different? We're a university founded by trailblazers, designed from the get-go to open doors and break down barriers. Our students and alumni are designing, engineering, teaching, and building a brighter future. So whether you're just starting out or taking your career to new heights, UNC Charlotte brings hands-on research and knowledge of the world to you. Be strong, be bold, be a Niner. UNC Charlotte. This is Niner Nation.
Good evening. My name is Gordon Hull, and I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at UNC Charlotte, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 30th annual Barnhardt Seminar on Ethics in the Business World. So I was remembering the other day that the Barnhardt Seminar last year was one of the very last events we were able to have before COVID struck and a really, really difficult and challenging year for all of us began. That's why I'm especially glad and especially grateful that we're able to be together this evening, albeit virtually, to hear from and learn from one of the people whose work put at the very center of our efforts to manage and deal with the COVID epidemic. In order to say more about the seminar in the evening, I'd like to welcome and introduce you to our Chancellor, Dr. Sharon Gaber. As many of you know, Dr. Gaber arrived here last summer, having managed the courage or bad timing, I'm not sure which, to take over a major university in the middle of a 100-year global pandemic. Whichever of those it was, we're very glad to have her. So, Dr. Gaber?
Well, thank you for that nice introduction, Gordon. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the annual Barnhardt Seminar on Ethics and the World of Business, featuring Susan DeVore, CEO of Premier, and a proud UNC Charlotte alumna and trustee. I know her words will enlighten and inspire us all this evening. We're very proud of the Barnhardt Seminar on Ethics, which is one of 3 lectures we host each year as part of the UNC Charlotte Civic Series presented by Bank of America. Throughout the years, it has enabled us to bring a number of distinguished speakers to campus, ranging from former mayors to directors of philanthropic foundations to banking and energy CEOs. The Barnhardt Seminar on Ethics has been a constant reminder to our students, faculty, staff, and alumni of the importance of personal ethics as we go about our work each day. The long and successful run of the Barnhardt program speaks to the strong ties between UNC Charlotte, the Barnhardt family, and the Charlotte community. Tonight's seminar has been made possible because of the generosity of the Barnhardt family who established this program in 1989. I'd like to acknowledge Bill and Harriet Barnhardt and the other members of their family who are here tonight, Jimmy, Harriet, Will, and Elsie Barnhardt. I'd also like to recognize Dennis Bunker, who's an alumnus and serves on our Board of Trustees, and Chancellor Emeritus Jim Woodward. Thank you also for joining us this evening. Tonight's program comes 1 week after we return to campus to begin in-person classes for the spring semester. There's no doubt that we've been faced with an unprecedented set of challenges this academic year. However, I remain energized and encouraged. Our UNC Charlotte faculty and staff are dedicated and talented, our students are creative and resilient, and our alumni are engaged and invested. Together, we're building on our mission to provide an accessible and affordable quality education for all students. We know that students have choices when it comes to higher education, and we want UNC Charlotte to be their choice. Our university is one of the great success stories in higher education, and I'm so grateful to be your chancellor. I now have the privilege of introducing tonight's speaker, a prominent business leader and a huge supporter and friend of UNC Charlotte. Susan DeVore is a leader in healthcare, the corporate boardroom, the community, and here on campus. As the CEO of Premier, she's been centered on driving innovation in healthcare and leading the industry through profound change by engaging stakeholders to co-develop solutions that support high quality, efficient, and sustainable care delivery models. Under Susan's leadership, Premier has been named one of the world's most ethical companies for the past 13 years, received the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, and earned the Best in Class title for overall healthcare management consulting. After more than a decade as CEO of Premier, Susan will retire on June 30th. As an industry-leading thinker, Susan has been named multiple times to Modern Healthcare's 100 Most Influential People and Top 25 Women in Healthcare lists. She was the recipient of the Charlotte Business Journal's 2018 Women in Business Lifetime Achievement Award, was named to Becker's Hospital Review's 2017 100 Great Healthcare Leaders to Know, and was recognized as a 2016 UNC Charlotte Distinguished Alumnus. Susan has served on the UNC Charlotte Board of Trustees since 2015. She was elected secretary in 2018 and vice chair in 2019. As you can tell, her leadership has been extensive. I also find it fitting that Susan will share her experiences and wisdom with us tonight as we begin the month-long celebration of Women's History Month. I'd now like to welcome Professor of Management and Certamen Distinguished Professor of Business Ethics, Dennis Arnold, who will serve as facilitator for tonight's discussion. Dennis is a prolific scholar and writer with a focus on business ethics, corporate misconduct, and public policy. He's past president of the Society for Business Ethics and has provided executive ethical leadership and compliance training at Fortune 500 companies, smaller enterprises, and nonprofit organizations. Dennis will walk us through how the evening will unfold, sharing why Susan's presence is so timely. Dennis?
Chancellor, good evening, everyone. Let me begin by explaining the unique format of the Barnhardt seminar for those of you who have not been with us in previous years. This is an event intended to facilitate dialogue between the audience and our guest speaker, so we had to be a little innovative this year in how we approach things. Given our online format this year, we will handle things differently. I will begin by briefly framing the issues as I do traditionally. Susan will then present her case and remarks. To engage with you, we will use polls on 3 occasions to get your judgment on what Susan and her team should have done given the challenging circumstances that they faced. So rather than giving the hard to answer qualitative questions, we're giving you yes or no questions, and we're going to ask for your responses in 3 different polls, which Susan will facilitate during her presentation. Then, at the end of her presentation, we will invite you to ask questions via the Zoom chat function, which you can begin using as the seminar proceeds. And I will moderate those questions for Susan. Now, our theme tonight is confronting scarce resources in the time of COVID. Every business leader must ask him or herself basic questions about the responsibilities of a firm. The larger the firm and the more impact on society, the greater the number and variety of questions there are to be asked. The pandemic has added layers of complexity to questions regarding such responsibilities in terms of our business leaders. In political philosophy, the division of moral labor refers to the institutional structure of society and the role different institutions and individuals should play in the shared goal of enhancing societal welfare. In reflecting on the division of moral labor in society, we are reflecting upon what institutions are responsible for the jobs, community health, education, environmental protection, and other goods necessary for society to flourish. Differences in the structures of liberal market economies, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, versus the structure of coordinated market economies, such as Japan and Germany, reflect differences in this view. With respect to the provision of healthcare goods and services, the United States is unique, even among liberal market economies, in allocating a large segment of the division of moral labor for healthcare goods and services to the private sector. Firms in the healthcare sector are somewhat unique in having 2 distinct missions or values: shareholder wealth creation and community health, or put it another way, patient welfare. As a simple illustration, think of the bipartisan uproar that was caused when Mylan increased the price of its EpiPens by 6 to 7-fold after it acquired the product. And it did so while simultaneously increasing executive compensation by millions of dollars. The collective outrage that ensued, causing congressional hearings, among other things, was driven by the view that its values were misaligned and that community health was being put in jeopardy as a result. Now, in the healthcare sector, leaders must balance these competing values. It's just a part of the industry, and it's one of the reasons the industry is so very interesting to study. The coronavirus pandemic has greatly increased the complexity of the task of managing firms in the healthcare industry. In the US alone, there have been over 28 million cases of coronavirus and over 500,000 deaths. We don't have good data on the overall number of hospitalizations across the entire nation and its territories, but estimates indicate that this past January, at the peak of need, daily hospitalizations reached over 132,000, and that's a low number, with COVID patients occupying at least 24,000 ICU beds daily. So this is just a daily figure, 132,000 patients in the hospital, 24,000 ICU beds occupied by COVID patients. Now, we're all aware of the acute shortages of PPE gear, respirators, and other medical equipment needed to provide care for these patients, but our healthcare providers desperately need this equipment, as do the hospitals that employ them and all the community health centers that help along the way. What we may not realize is the central role that Susan and her team at Premier have provided in supplying this equipment, have played in supplying this equipment. Susan is going to walk us through many of the challenges Premier confronted in allocating scarce resources in the time of COVID. Susan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dennis. Appreciate it very much. And I'm so looking forward to this dialogue. So please send your questions into the chat so that we can have a great dialogue at the end. And as Dennis said, we will be interspersing, polling questions for you to help us think through as we look back on the decisions we've made. And we want to know what you think about that. I think first we probably need to start by explaining what is Premier. What do we do? What role do we play in the healthcare ecosystem? If you'll go to the first slide, Premier is a company that was actually built and founded by healthcare systems. Hospitals and healthcare systems decided, you know what, this industry is very fragmented. We're all buying the same things, the drugs, the PPE, the supplies, the capital equipment. And maybe we should think about aggregating our purchasing volume and buying together. And so Premier was formed, 30 years ago or more, to actually help health systems and be an arbiter for the contractual relationships with suppliers. So when you think about Premier, think about us as sitting inside healthcare systems. We have a whole field team that sits inside healthcare systems. We help them with supply chain, and we have all kinds of technology and technology enablement, artificial intelligence, and data to help them improve their clinical performance and their cost performance. Supply chain is a huge cost element, but we help them with labor productivity. We help them with clinical performance. And so all in all, we serve over 4,000 hospitals and health systems, but we also serve the providers around them, doctors, clinics, ambulatory surgery centers, nursing homes, all kinds of other entities in and around healthcare systems. Our relationships with our customers, the healthcare system, primary customers, many of them have been with us for 20 years or more, 19 years or more. So these are very long-standing relationships with a large footprint of the healthcare system. What's unique about Premier is that we actually sit at the intersection. So we have hospitals, we have doctors and other providers. We have 2,000 suppliers, all the big healthcare supply chain companies that you know and are aware of, Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer and all of the supply chain companies. We also know that our health systems get basically 75% of their revenue from Medicare and Medicaid, which are government programs. And so we have a full-time group of people in Washington, D.C. trying to help us anticipate, understand, and help the governments, federal and state, understand what's happening in healthcare and how to drive improvement. And we have a fundamental belief that the healthcare system in the US needs to be transformed from the inside out. It needs to be transformed where care is delivered by the providers delivering that care. Those are the folks that are committed long-term to the communities, and that's where healthcare needs to be transformed. We recognize that you have to have a ton of data, and we say 100 billion data points going back 17 years on all of the clinical and financial and operating things happening within health systems. We have data on 45% of the patients in the country, and we help our healthcare systems buy $67 billion of supplies every year. So you can see that when this unprecedented pandemic, worldwide, 195 countries, 7 billion people potentially affected by this, that the intersection between supply chain and clinical information was going to be very important. So very early on in the pandemic, we recognized that we had an obligation to our customers, an obligation to the government, an obligation to our communities, to really do everything we could do to help. This is not something that any of us anticipated at this scale. And so everybody was forced into making all kinds of different decisions very quickly. So if you go to the next slide, when times like that happen, it really tests, I think, cultures, and it tests values, and it tests missions. Dennis talked about the uniqueness of healthcare and the different roles that different groups play. Our mission is really clear to us. It's to improve the health of communities across the country every day, every minute, in every way that we can. Clinical, cost, productivity, performance. In a sense, we view ourselves as having a social mission, but we're delivering that social mission with business principles. We took the company public actually about 7.5 years ago because we needed more access to capital to invest in the technology and the services that we needed to actually be able to help health systems transform themselves at scale. So we use that collaborative power of a national footprint. We learn together, we share data transparently with each other. We figure out what works and what doesn't work to drive improvement. And then we help from the inside of the healthcare system. You can see there on the right-hand side, our values, and you can see that the first one is integrity. And when you sit at the nexus of government, not-for-profit health systems, physician providers, suppliers and manufacturers in the private sector, it's critical that the way in which you conduct business and the way you make decisions is guided by significant values around integrity, around performance and performance improvement, around innovation with as fast as the healthcare market advances and as fast as technology is advancing. And you recognize that none of that is possible unless you have world-class talent and people who believe in the mission of the company and really exist to try to do everything they can to help drive improvement. So if you'll go to the next slide, Premier and Sharon, Chancellor Gaber told you about some of our awards and distinctions. We're really proud to be, one of the 100 most ethical companies in the world, and to have been so for now, it's actually now 14 years. We just got notified. And they ask you a series of 200 questions, and they sort of assess, whether you meet the marks or not. And we've been really proud of that, but also proud of our Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. So if you'll move past that, let's get right into COVID. So with COVID, this was a worldwide pandemic. This was not something that wasn't completely expected in some ways, because Premier for many years had worried about the fact that only 5 or 10% of our PPE products, our masks, our gloves, our shields, only 5-10% of it was produced domestically, and over 80% of it was coming from the Far East and Southeast Asia. And we saw in the Summer Olympics, manufacturing get shut down in China. We saw the H1N1 epidemic. We saw the Ebola implications. Those were all much smaller scale, but they certainly told us that we as a country were too dependent on too few countries for critical supplies in any epidemic, pandemic, bioterrorism event. Premier actually worried about that a lot, and we built a direct sourcing company about 10 years ago. And we also built a division of our company to help with drug shortages, because 20% of the active ingredients in drugs actually come from those same locations, foreign countries in Southeast Asia. And so we were worried about our dependence for pharmaceuticals and our dependence for critical supply chain products on just a few countries. And so we made investments to at least have a capability to diversify the manufacturing and to bring it, near shore or onshore, or at least diversify it amongst a number of countries. One of the challenges with that was, though, that typically if it were manufactured in the US, it was higher cost. And with all the pressures on healthcare costs, the federal government, the state governments, and the health systems across the country were trying to do everything they could to keep costs down, and therefore lived with and accepted in some ways that dependence on just a few foreign countries. So when the pandemic hit in Wuhan, which is very near where a lot of these products were manufactured, and manufacturing plants were shut down, exports were stopped, that created a challenge for the whole world and a challenge for the US. The challenge was exacerbated by the fact that even when stuff was sent from those countries, it was sent on container ships, which took a long time to get to their eventual locations. And so, the lack of adequate supply, the surging in demand. So demand for various products went up 300%, 500%, 700%, 1700%, 3000%, depending on which product you were talking about. So that combination of demand surge, and then one of the dynamics our healthcare systems faced was they were worried that they were going to have the hospitalizations and the need for product that Dennis described. And so they started hoarding and they started over ordering. And so when you combine all of that, it's not surprising that we had the tremendous challenges, just, law of supply and demand. The other thing we learned in this process was that the stockpiles had not been invested in at a federal or state level. And most health systems lived with just-in-time inventory, meaning they didn't have a ton of stockpiles. And so when people kind of expected the government to have stockpiles, what we found was that the stockpiles didn't have as much as we thought they might have. And some of the stuff that they did have, had been in the warehouses too long and wasn't usable. And so we were ill-equipped from a strategic national stockpile perspective. The other challenge we all face, and this is a little bit more unique in the US maybe than in some other countries, and that is that we have a pretty fragmented approach to healthcare and to securing supplies. And we had private sector health systems doing it on their own. We had states doing it. We had federal government doing it. Between the states and territories, you have 64 different ways of doing it just at the state level. And so the organizing principles around how you coordinate a response when you have a system that's sort of designed that way, just made it more difficult. And then you layer on that although this country has tremendous technology, tremendous artificial intelligence capabilities, tremendous data sets, tremendous technology companies, those also were not integrated. And the federal government had not been able, again, because they probably were trying to keep healthcare costs down, to invest technologically in advanced technologies at the CDC level, at the FDA level, at the Health and Human Services level. And so naturally, when you have a demand surge and you have a supply shortage, all kinds of people come out of the woodwork. So gray market companies, black market companies, people purporting to have products to sell, popped up everywhere. And when you have health systems, federal and state governments desperate for product, the question emerges as to whether and how they deal with gray market companies. So that was the situation. So if you go to the next page, we have faced many questions and many ethical questions over the last almost 12 months now. And so I thought what we'd do is go through a few of them with you, ask you what you think on a few of them, and then talk to you about kind of how we worked through it and how we made the decisions we made. So really, I chose 5 questions. The first one was, out of desperation, should we do business with unknown suppliers? Should we look to the gray market for supplies, given the demand and the knowledge that there was no way we were going to be able to supply the demand? The second question was, if and when we find the supplies, how do we fairly determine who should get them and who should get them first? The third question that we had to address was a question about a program called AirBridge, which I'll describe a little bit later. But we had the opportunity to participate in a government initiative to try to get supplies to health systems faster. The fourth question there is, if we have a fragmented system with manufacturers, suppliers, distributors, group purchasing organizations like Premier, government, federal and state governments, how would we actually organize public and private sector entities to work together on a coordinated response? And that meant working directly with competitors, fierce competitors. That meant sharing data and information. That meant sharing data and information with the federal and state governments. And so how do we do that? And should we do that? And should we be transparent about the pricing of products and all the questions that go with that? And then the last question is that we had several non-members of Premier. Remember, I said we serve 4,100 hospitals, only about 2,500 of those in supply chain. And so we had other health systems, non-customers, calling us saying, can you help us? Can you provide supplies? And so is that an act of goodwill? Is that something we should do? But if it takes away from our existing customers who have big gaps in their supplies, what does that mean? So these are the 5 questions that we hope to talk to you about and get some of your insights on. Let's go to the first one. So out of desperation, the question is, should Premier do business with unknown suppliers first? So the way, I have to tell you, the way a group purchasing organization works is we create competitive friction between and among suppliers, and we clinically evaluate their products. And then our health systems have committees, specialized committees, nursing committees, lab committees, imaging committees, operating room committees, and they decide which suppliers meet the clinical specifications, and then we negotiate on their behalf for best price, and then the members, the health systems, choose who will be on contract, and then we execute the terms and conditions of the contract. So what that naturally means is not everybody wins a contract. And so we have GPO contracts, people that have won those contracts. But the question here for us was, should we add other suppliers who were not on contract? And the second question is, should we go to the gray markets for suppliers if we can't get enough of what we need from the traditional suppliers in the market? So if you would answer question 1 and answer question 2. Do you think we should have worked with unknown suppliers? And do you think we should have gone to the gray market? Okay, well, here's the results. So we have a divided result actually in both regards. Very interesting. So, and this was our dilemma, right? This was not an easy question for us. So if you'll go to the next page, I'll describe a little bit about what we did. So first of all, we decided that we should do business with unknown suppliers and with suppliers who had not been on contract with Premier or had not won the contract with Premier. But we had a lot of rules, and the rules were, first, if they had been through our process but not won a contract, but they had met all the requirements clinically, we added them to contract. We created a 6-month window and we said, if your products are clinically effective, you tell us what your price is, we're going to add you to the contracts, and then our health systems could choose to use those contracts or not. We decided we needed everybody that was legitimately and clinically effective to be on contract in some ways, regardless of price. And we would let our members decide whether they were willing to pay those prices. With the gray market, we also went to the gray market. And we vetted 3,000 gray market suppliers. What we decided to do was create a centralized function for that. And we asked our health systems, please send us the gray market, emails you're getting so that we can vet them. And the way we vetted them was, we said, 1, we want to be able to inspect your manufacturing plant. Where is this stuff coming from? And no matter where in the world it was. And because we had a direct sourcing company, we could do that. We said we want to look at the specific specifications of the product. We want you to send us samples of the product so that we can clinically evaluate them and touch and feel them. And we're not going to send any money in advance of receiving the product. We're going to take the money and put it in an escrow. And if everything else plays out and we think the products are acceptable, then we'll release the money out of escrow. That eliminated a whole bunch of them because, and some even of our health systems who were desperate for supplies did, contracts with gray market suppliers, and some got burned because the products never came, or when they did come, they were not of the quality that the healthcare system needed. And it was so important to us to maintain our reputation for clinical quality, safety, and effectiveness that we were not willing to sacrifice any part of that. Now, what I will say is that there were substitute products that were developed. For example, these N95 masks, which are those respirators that are highly protective. There was something called a KN95 mask, which wasn't as good as an N95, but given the huge shortage of masks, we engaged in some substitute products. And we also worked with our health systems to make sure they had conservation mechanisms so that they could try to extend the products for as long as possible. At the end of the day, we added probably a couple of hundred suppliers who were not on contract, but had been vetted before. We added 120 new suppliers from the gray market out of 3,000 that we found turned out to be legitimate. We agreed to work with 7 new Asian factories after we confirmed their quality. And then about 6 months into it, and we started actually right when the pandemic started, we decided to co-invest with domestic companies to bring the commitment of our health systems to their manufacturing for N95 masks. We did it with Prestige Ameritech for isolation gowns. We did it with DeVore. We're now thinking through how we get that done with gloves, because gloves are a significant shortage now. And we tried to diversify the supply chain. So that's where we ended up. So the half of you that said, yes, we should do it, we agree with you. That's what we ended up doing. Okay, let's go to the next question. Next question is, when we find supplies, how do we fairly determine who should get them and who should get them first? We're not going to ask you to answer this question for us. It's not really a yes and no question. What we decided, because you can imagine, we had upset customers, we had panicked customers, we had customers who were worried about people dying, worried about employees getting the coronavirus. And so it was a really serious time. And we decided that we had to have some way to figure out with limited supplies who would get them and how we would determine that. And so we established a task force of health systems, big national, regional health systems. And we said, we want you to develop with us the methodology. So you'll be talking about your fellow healthcare systems as we make these decisions. And so what we did was we built a technology that basically took the Johns Hopkins COVID cases and predictive model, which was by geography, by zip code. And so we basically embedded into our technology the every day, every 7 to 10 days update of where the virus was and where it looked like it was going next. So we could try to anticipate the volumes of hospitalizations, ICUs, ventilators, and other equipment needed, PPE, drugs, all of that. So we built this model and we turned it into this 7 to 10 day, updating model so that health systems would know, and we would know 7 to 10 days from now who needs the supplies and at what level. And we used that model to determine, we looked at the health system's historical utilization levels of those products. We predicted where it was going next, predicted the surge, and then tried to allocate products to the places that needed it most first. So what happened, and this was an interesting kind of ethical question, was in the early days of the pandemic, almost 50% of all of the allocation was going to New York City hospitals, because that's where the concentration of COVID was first. And our other health systems had to essentially say, yep, we see the numbers, we see what's happening there, we see that I don't have very many cases in my market yet, we have limited supply, we're gonna have to let it go there first, while we have all these other initiatives designed to get more product into the country so that maybe I can get mine when I need it if it comes to my market. So we leveraged the data we had. We tried to go to the federal government multiple times to say, use this technology for your own federal and state allocation of supplies, limited supplies. Just so many agencies and so little time, and the technology systems of those agencies pretty antiquated, and they just didn't think they had the time to invest in that technology implementation, if you will. And so what happened is sort of manual efforts were created with the CDC and with health systems and with governments to try to get it to the right places. I think when you have lack of true technology enabled data, you're maybe even open yourself up more to political challenges and people intervening in, political processes to get supplies where they thought they were needed. So that's how we handled that. Let's go to the second question that we're going to ask you about and poll. So we had I think, ethical question early on about whether Premier should participate in something called AirBridge in order to get supplies to our health systems faster. And AirBridge was a program designed by the federal government. They realized that so many of those products were coming on container ships. And I was in conversations, nights, weekends, days with generals and others who said, what if we could mobilize commercial airlines and military airlines, and we can send them to the places that these products are manufactured and load them up and fly them back here and get them to the US faster. And so they called this Project AirBridge. They went to all the major distributors, the medical surgical supply distributors like Cardinal and McKesson and others, came to Premier because we had our own direct sourcing company and we were sourcing supplies from China and other places, and basically said, do you want to participate in this, or will you participate in this? And they required that you submit data. They also required that 50% of the product that came back over on those airplanes, the government could designate where the products went. In other words, they would determine, where 50% of the product went, which states, which health systems, and asked us whether we would participate. So now the question for you is, if you were me, would you, or do you believe that Premier should participate in the Project AirBridge to get the products to the US faster? So we did not participate in Project AirBridge. And the reason we didn't participate in Project AirBridge was that the government had control of 50% of the products. And maybe I should have given you a little more information before I asked the question, but they also wouldn't agree to be transparent with us or anybody about where it was going. So it was not a two-way exchange of information. It was basically a one-way exchange of information. And the other thing we knew was that every one of our health systems used all of those distributors. And so they would be on the receiving end, if you will, of whatever 50% those distributors were able to get to them. They might be on the receiving end of what the government would get to them. And we actually thought we could help more if we paid for our own commercial planes to go get product that we had and bring it back to the US and supplement for our health systems what they were getting from Project AirBridge or getting from the government. I think we might have made a different decision if there had been transparency both ways, and if we could have had some view into the methodology for allocating that 50%. We didn't know how they were going to make those decisions. And, even during Project AirBridge and afterwards, our health systems would tell us that, stuff would land in their ports and then it would get confiscated, and stuff they thought they were going to get, they didn't get. And political needs intervened in the process. And so in hindsight, we think our health systems actually ended up in a better place because we were able to supplement Airbridge, and we were worried about being accused of or being a part of the lack of transparency to how decisions were being made and who was getting it and who wasn't. And we're just not comfortable and wanted to layer our products on top of Airbridge directly. So that's ultimately, but we had, I remember being on the phone all weekend with our team saying, are we a good citizen if we don't participate? Or are we a better citizen if we actually layer on our capabilities on top of Airbridge, since Airbridge was going to be determined 50% by the government anyway? So that's where we ended up. Okay, next question. So this question came up early on, which was all of our competitors, group purchasing competitors like us, distributors, manufacturers who compete with each other. It was early on, and I was talking to my guy in Washington, and we said, look, we have to do something to coordinate the response. This is going to be a nightmare. It's a nightmare anyway, but it's going to be a real nightmare if we can't coordinate response. So we organized a coalition, and I got the list, of the 25 companies that were most critical to the pandemic and the supplies needed and the drugs needed. And we went to Health and Human Services and we said, let us help organize a public-private coalition. And we had all these companies on contract. The distributors were on contract, the manufacturers on contract, our competitors were willing to do it as well with us. And we all got on the phone and said, we just have to put our fierce competitive spirits aside, and we have to figure out how we're going to collaborate to help the government solve this problem. So we created the coalition. Well, the first question was, how do we even share information? And are we going to get accused, of antitrust later if we do share information? And how are we going to make sure that the pricing information all of us had, which was proprietary, should we be transparent with that? Should we protect that? And actually we decided to do a couple of things. One, we decided to hire a third-party organization, a company called Healthcare Ready. They actually help the government deal with weather-related and other kinds of natural disasters. And so they were very, very knowledgeable about organizing public sector, federal government agencies, and private sector companies to deal with natural disasters. So we engaged Healthcare Ready. And then I talked to all the CEOs of the 25 companies and said, are you in? And most all of them were in, about 20 or 25 of them were in. We started out having calls 2 and 3 times a week and throughout the pandemic, and then it, ended up going to once a week and that sort of thing. But it was so helpful to the government because the military understands how to respond to natural disasters. They understand military warfare. They weren't really, really deep in understanding how the privatized healthcare system worked and the details around all of these products and the supply and the demand and where they were manufactured. And they just didn't have visibility into all of that information. And so we organized this, and the way it worked was the federal government, CDC, FDA, Health and Human Services, all kinds of federal agencies, FEMA, would send their questions and their needs to our coalition through Healthcare Ready. We would individually as companies determine our response and give it back to them. They would ask for a standard format. We'd give it back to them, and then they would use it to help make their decisions. There's something called a DPA waiver and protection that actually they provided for us. And they said, if you'll do this with us, we will protect the information that you're sharing. We won't make it an antitrust question. And Healthcare Ready will keep it in separate firewalled places and roll it up for the government use, but not for the use of the individual companies. And so we all agreed to do it. It was an amazing experience. I've been, working for 20, 30 years in healthcare. It was an amazing experience to see competitors, fierce competitors, actually figuring out how together they're going to provide the information the government needs to help get supplies to healthcare systems. So that's that one. Let's go to the next one. Okay, this one we do want you to answer. So the question was, non-members, people who were not a part of Premier, needed supplies too. They were with our competitors. And the question was, we got calls from some of them. And the question was, should Premier help them or reserve the scarce supplies for its existing customer base? There were 3 other GPOs like Premier. The market is pretty saturated, meaning everybody has a group purchasing relationship. And so the question was, we'd get calls from members who said, my GPO isn't able to help me, my distributor isn't able to help me, and I need 500,000 masks, and can you help? So the question is, should we have helped? I think, this was a tough question, and what I would say is that in a normal circumstance, we probably would have helped them because we would have viewed it as a business opportunity, build goodwill, show them how we're a better solution for them than their existing relationship. In the severe scarcity of supplies, though, and the number of health systems that we serve, we decided that we had an allocation process. We were actually not even providing it to our members who needed it. We were making them wait because of the way the COVID-19 disease was progressing. And we just decided that we couldn't not provide it to even our own members, and then provide it to non-members. We talked to all of them, so we were helpful as much as we could about suppliers out there, gray markets out there that we had vetted, or information to help them. But we ultimately decided that our member approach and our member committee that was determining the allocation of very, very scarce resources, and they were still bursting at the seams, and they still didn't have 50% of the product that they needed, that we had to go there first. And so that's what we did. And I think that's it. And what I would say is there were no perfect answers in any of this. It was extremely stressful for providers on the front line. I mean, the health systems in communities, Atrium is one of our health systems, the health systems and the frontline workers and their dedication, and the people in the supply chain areas, their dedication during this is just absolutely amazing. The development of the vaccine in a year is unprecedented. I actually think the rollout of the vaccine, even though it's been difficult at first to get going, I think that our country has done amazing work to deal with something we've never seen before. And I think that the healthcare industry and I think the healthcare supply chain will be forever changed as a result of COVID-19. So I'll stop there, Dennis. And I don't know if you've gotten any questions coming in, but we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Susan. We do have some questions, and I want to encourage anyone who has a question now to go ahead and use the chat function and go ahead and send us those questions now. But I do have some questions lined up for you. First, there are several questions that came in about what the definition of a gray market is. Could you help unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, so it's probably not a clean definition, but a gray market is those suppliers that could be legitimate. So you actually could look at the emails, and you could look at the language, you could look at the pictures, you could look at, we got pretty adept at looking at being able to tell what was counterfeit and what wasn't. But gray market was the companies we thought had a 50-50 chance of being legitimate. And that was our own definition. You know, I sent everyone I got, because I got them, we got hundreds of thousands of them. I sent everyone I got. I didn't try to decide if I thought they were gray market or black market, or I sent them to our central place. They eliminated the ones that you would call black market quickly, and then they evaluated the rest.
Okay, great. And did you run into many problems with regard to the quality of some of these new suppliers with respect to the products that they were providing you in the end, or was your quality control up to handling that?
So we had a significant quality control process. There were lots of questions, though, about quality as it relates to conservation of product. So if you wear the same mask, and if there's a shortage and you're conserving masks, or you're conserving gloves, or you're conserving, is that a quality question? And then we also had some challenges with the government, because the government had a process that you may have heard of called emergency use authorization. So things they normally wouldn't allow in healthcare, given the pandemic, given the shortage, they would allow. And one of the challenges we had, for example, with N95 masks, which are those important respirator masks, the KN95s from various companies, some were on the approved list, and then later were on the unapproved list. And people had already bought the inventory of those masks, and now they're unapproved, meaning they may not meet the quality specifications. I think what most health systems did, because the pandemic required so many people in so many communities, they were able to take those products, and we were able to take those products and say, use them in schools, use them in grocery stores, use them in places that are not healthcare workers on the front line dealing with patients. So yeah, there were some quality issues, but I think that we did a good job of making sure that no quality thresholds were breached when it came to patients in healthcare systems.
Great, great. One of the questions that came in is, did you as a company, as a CEO of the company, did you feel vulnerable given these circumstances? And I guess a flip side of that might be, did you ever feel so indispensable? And then just to follow up on that, relative to something that you said earlier, what types of systematic changes to the healthcare system do you anticipate the pandemic will result in, or at least most likely?
Yeah. So first question, did we feel vulnerable or indispensable? And what I would say is we did feel indispensable, but we felt like everybody was so upset with where things were that even though we were indispensable, people weren't always happy that we were indispensable. They were frustrated. They were not getting their product from Airbridge. They were not getting enough from us. They wanted more, wanted more, wanted more. And so I do think we were indispensable, but I don't think it was easy for anybody. And I do think, we were a public company. And when all the health systems around the country were forced to shut down all elective procedures, that affected financially the buying patterns for supplies for all those elective procedures. And we made a decision early on, which was also in my mind an ethical decision. The prices of all that PPE and such were going up. And we made the decision for our direct sourcing company to maintain our current margin, meaning if costs went up, we would raise our price, but we weren't raising our price and expanding our margin at the same time. We were basically keeping margin where it was. That did create some, significant impact to our financial performance, which we have explained to the street and continue to explain to the street. We also, because we had a direct sourcing company to go get that PPE, those volumes obviously skyrocketed, but that's the very low margin business that we didn't expand. And so we had puts and takes in terms of the impact to the company and the complexity of explaining it to the public markets. When I think about the changes that will stay and the ways will be forever changed. One, I think we all figured out that telemedicine could work and maybe could be efficient. And so I think telemedicine and the use of telemedicine will continue. We all recognize that we were way too dependent on foreign manufacturing. I think there are a lot of different activities, and I think the federal government will incent the activity to bring manufacturing of critical products back to the US or near shore or offshore. We don't think it should all be in the US because then you have the same problem that you have when it's all in Asia. And so we think there will be a movement towards diversified supply chain. We think this exposed the need for stockpiles. And so now every health system and federal state government has, 60, 90, 120 day stockpiles. I think they might be more virtual in the future, but I think that change will be forever with us. I also think that the cost of the stimulus and the impact to healthcare and the impact to healthcare costs of all of this makes the Medicare funding source, the Medicare Trust Fund, with significant financial challenges. And so I think this, and if we get another stimulus, somehow the financial effects of this are going to make healthcare costs a continuing challenge. And so I think that the federal and state governments will have to continue to force new payment models and more predictable sort of capped or global payment models so that we can manage through the financial aftermath of this. So that's a couple of the ways I think it'll change.
Great, really interesting. I'm going to ask you two more questions that are amalgamations of questions that have been asked on the chat. First one, there are a number of questions about the role of the federal government, whether or not, for example, the failure to have a properly stocked national stockpile was itself an ethical failure, whether or not the Defense Production Act, whether if it was enacted, it would have helped you and your company respond to the crisis, and whether a better coordinated national response would have helped you respond to the crisis. Those are three different chat questions, sort of intermingled. You can answer as you please.
Yeah, I actually think if the country had continued to invest in stockpiles and spent the money stockpiling with the worry that maybe we would one day have a pandemic would have helped, I don't think it would have solved the problem. Because when you have a worldwide pandemic and it's 195 countries and 7 billion people, I think it would have helped. I don't think any of us realized we didn't have it much at all. And I think that I think it would have helped, and I think we learned from it. And I think the hard part is when government budgets are being created and you've got to figure out where to spend the money, and not on the top of your list is a worldwide pandemic with a shortage of supplies coming from China. Although I think we had some clues that we had significant risk there. So I think it would have helped, but I don't think it would have solved the problem. Same is true of the DPA. I mean, actually, we got product from Lowe's, we got product from Ford Motor Company, we got product from various companies. And I think with ventilators particularly, you saw all the news about the DPA being the source of forcing domestic manufacturing. I actually think, and the Biden administration is talking about continuing that process. I think that's a long-term solution. It wasn't as much a short-term solution because you couldn't get the manufacturer of ventilators done fast enough for the surges in COVID. But I think long-term, and I think we're in a much better situation already today because the government has been leveraging the DPA and has been building a national strategy on a going forward basis. I do think the national response could have been more coordinated. And I think part of the thing I probably would change the most is the resistance and politicization, making political the crisis, the medical crisis. So if people don't believe it's really a crisis, then I don't think you get as much of the national coordination and regional coordination, state coordination that you needed. I think the coalition was critical. I think FEMA and FEMA's role in trying to organize, and I think the government did a nice job with Healthcare Ready of bringing, it was 32 different government agencies that were involved in the decisions and the emergency use authorizations. And so it's hard to be critical when we've never faced anything like this before and we had to react immediately. Like we didn't have time to build stockpiles and time to build, new ventilators. And so all in all, I would say, there are over 500,000 people who lost their lives and it's still here. And we still have 30 to 50%, resistance to the vaccine. We sent a letter to the Biden administration with all the things we thought needed to be in place to have us better positioned on a going forward basis. But there's always room for improvement, I think, in the national coordinated response.
Great, thank you. Okay, and then the last question, several questions came in about how you maintain a strong ethical culture at Premier, whether or not you have a lead ethics person or ethics experts that helps you in making some of these decisions, or whose job is ethics and compliance outside the general counsel. So could you answer that for us and let us know a little bit more about how you achieve 14 years on Ethisphere's list of the 100 best or most ethical companies out there?
Yeah, so we do have an ethics and compliance officer who is a senior leader in the team, a vice president, and that is his only job. He reports directly into the audit committee of the board. We also have a very robust HR function because we believe it's HR and ethics and compliance together. I think culture, kind of comes from the top, from the board, from the management team, from the CEO, and is embedded throughout the organization. I think that when people believe in the work that they're doing and the mission of the work, it's this idea of a truly social mission that you bring business principles to. We do a lot of training. We have required training. We do a lot of situational analysis, meaning the training is various situations that people respond to. We test our employees. We require 100% compliance. We talk about it. We have hotlines. We have little tent cards in the office when we were in the office, where people can call in anonymously. We research every every suggestion or idea. We go to our board every quarter with all of the HR and compliance questions that have been raised. So they see, they can see whether there's any spikes in ethics questions or issues. Because we do manufacture in the Far East, we have to be and are part of the foreign corrupt practices work that we have to do. Because we have all kinds of personal health information, we are very attuned to privacy and the privacy requirements. Also very concerned about cybersecurity. And so it's a big part of our infrastructure. And, I like to say, values and integrity and ethics, it's how you behave in the light and the dark. And I think we just get after it a lot of different ways.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. And thanks to the audience for these great questions in the chat function. Really appreciated those. I want to turn the evening over to Chancellor Gaber now.
Well, thank you very much. And Susan, thank you for all of your insights. As a thank you for your presentation this evening, we've given a donation in your honor to the Greater Charlotte Healthcare Executives Group Masters in Health Administration Scholarship. This scholarship goes to graduate students who are pursuing careers in healthcare leadership roles. Thank you again, and thank you all for being here tonight and joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and go Niners.